He's willing. We're glad he's willing. So let me just quickly introduce two amazing people who we're closing the conference with to talk about this question of how policy can spur climate innovation. Well, let me start with Catherine. Catherine, I'll just read, her bio is a good bio, so I'm just gonna read a few lines from her bio.
Read my bio.
She's the founder and principal of Climate and Nature Solutions and launched Women Leading in Climate at COP26 in Glasgow last November. As Canada's first Minister of Environment and Climate Change in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's cabinet, she was a lead negotiator of the Paris Agreement before introducing and successfully defending landmark legislation that established a carbon price across Canada. That's quite a few achievements, so cool. Thank you for being here. Now, Fred Krupp, similarly accomplished. I don't know, you didn't create EDF, or did you?
No.
Were you there at the very beginning?
No.
I don't know the old dim, dark history, but you've kind of been EDF to me for 3 decades, as it says in your bio. And EDF, which has been a huge partner for us here at the Techonomy Climate, but is way more important than that because it has really been, I think, one of the great innovative environmental organizations, partly for its willingness not to demonize business, but to understand that if we don't bring business along in the energy, environmental responsibility transition, we're never going to succeed. And EDF has had partnerships with FedEx, KKR, McDonald's, Walmart, and others, which I wrote about as far back as like 1988, I think, something like that. Anyway, thank you for both being here. So I want to just quickly ask you both, at the macro level, maybe start with you, Fred, how can policy spur climate innovation?
Well, there's a myriad of ways. So both in the positive and also getting out of the way, because there's a lot of policy obstacles to getting things right. But in the positive way, there's renewable portfolio standards, there's low carbon fuel standards, there's regulations that require companies to clean up. That itself creates an incentive to innovate. There's disclosure requirements like the SEC is considering, or what methane sat that we heard about earlier today is doing. Disclosure creates demand to clean up, and that's a policy. When disclosure is required by governments, as it should be, that's a policy that creates innovation. The most powerful policy of all, where Catherine and EDF cooperated when she was environment minister in the Paris Agreement, in my mind, is carbon pricing. And Article 6, which Catherine led the world in adopting in Paris, along with New Zealand and a couple of other countries. Sorry to say, not so much the United States at the time, but I know Catherine can't say that, but the carbon pricing, by taking something that's an external cost and putting it inside the balance sheet, drives in places where it's used, like here in California, drives decisions right down to the entrepreneur level and creates a hunt for the lowest cost way to solve these problems. So that's the beginning of the catalog, the last one being, I think, the most powerful.
So in particular, we heard about methane sat. You think of methane sat as a lever for policy creation, in effect.
Yes, as Tom said so eloquently earlier, we've learned that data itself does not equal action, but data is often a prerequisite to action.
Right.
So the companies in the oil and gas business has been telling us for over a decade that they don't have methane pollution. Yeah. And then, when it turns out they do, when we use technologies that they have to agree are accurate, and they make pledges that they will now get their emissions down to virtually zero, that accountability creates an incentive for them to be clean, or a huge penalty if they are caught not doing what they've promised.
Good, thank you. So how do you think about policy as a lever for innovation in climate?
Well, it's kind of funny being in this audience because I know a lot of people are like, oh God, government, just get out of the way. But look, I think it goes together. I don't think tech's going to save the planet. I don't think policy is going to save the planet. We all need to, work together. Look, pricing is critically important. So I'll just take that one, which Fred has already eloquently talked about. I mean, in the Paris Agreement, Article 6 is critical because it will drive the innovation, but you need to have rules around double counting. You need to, if you don't, then business will shy away from it or it'll all fall apart. In Canada, by putting a price on pollution, which by the way, was not easy, because I think sometimes in the US, everyone's like, oh, it's so easy in Canada, you're so nice. I don't even want to talk about occupied Ottawa. I'm from Ottawa, it's no longer occupied, that's good news. But it was really hard. It was a big flipping fight. And I had all the conservative premiers, a bunch of guys, who literally were called the Resistance. They named themselves the Resistance and fought me. But it was really weird. And it's funny because I think back to, I've spent a lot of time in California, including as minister, because you had this guy called Trump and it was really bad, the messaging. And so I had to come to California. It was like, we're doing things together, like carbon pricing. But I met with George Shultz and he's like, just do carbon pricing, but do it as a fee and dividend, but give the money back was his biggest thing. So we did that. And now we're seeing that there is the innovation because our price goes up to $170 as across the board by 2030. And so that
175 per what?
it's $170 per ton by 2030.
Per ton of CO2 emitted.
And it starts off very low, right? So, you need it to go up. And of course, we still have the challenge of different governments, right? Like, so we could have a new government that'll come in. We did win at the Supreme Court, but any government can dismantle it. But because we've given the money back, more families are getting more money than they pay. And it's actually lifting kids. We've looked at families being lifted out of poverty because it's by definition a progressive policy. But we're trying to backstop it. So we're looking at how do we make sure, including, so we can talk about another policy innovation, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is not actually a bank, it's a financing vehicle for sustainable infrastructure. But if we can build in that price so that with the investments, so that you guarantee it, so we can backstop it to 2030, because of course there's a concern. I don't think that, the current government is going to be in power forever. So you need to do that. But I guess my broader point is like, one, you're going to need good policy. Because sometimes policy sucks. And if it's bad policy, it's going to have unintended consequences and it's not going to drive the innovation. But if you have the right policy, it can actually drive the innovation. And so many of the solutions I hear about here probably had, policy may have had some role. GHG sat as a great Canadian company. They were a bit ahead of the game, but even in Alberta, they started with a rule, methane rule, which was 40%, that you had to reduce emissions by 40% from oil and gas. And so suddenly there was huge adoption, and lo and behold, good companies want to not be, don't want to be, caught out, not actually disclosing their emissions properly. So I think it goes hand in hand. It doesn't always, so I know that. And so sometimes governments screw things up. And we did a clean fuel standard, and it's been very, very hard because you have different policies interacting with each other, and there's a complexity issue. But I think it's powerful, and there's just so many examples of this. And in Canada, we have a climate plan across the board. We had to do it sector by sector. And if you want to look, actually, the Prime Minister just announced the new version of the climate plan, and it actually tackles sectors. So oil and gas has to reduce its overall emissions by over 40% from 2019 levels. And so that's going to drive more innovation, right?
And just mechanically, really quickly, how do you give the money back to the people? That's sounds sort of un-American.
I wanted to give it with a big check that I handed out personally because I thought that was really effective. It was hard. So everything's always hard. So we had to do it through the tax system, which I don't know, do you guys have H&R Block? I don't know, they do the tax. It was the best thing because I was like, how are we gonna let people know? Because no one ever knows what policies government do. And they actually were advertising during this tax season, the climate action incentives. So because people wanted to get the money. We're now able to do it through rebates that you actually get a check, every quarterly check.
I mean, sort of like if you live in Alaska, you get money from the oil industry. Wow.
Yeah,
only in reverse.
it's in reverse, although it's still a fight because people will say you're going to pay more at the pump and they'll forget. There was actually a sticker campaign, although it was quite good because the stickers didn't stick by my good friends, the Resistance, but they would just say, this is the price you're going to pay and it's going to go up and up and up. They didn't say, well, actually going to get more money back.
So Fred, I hate to say it, but the prospect of good policy is almost something I don't feel is a reasonable discussion in the United States at this point. I mean, how do you think there's a pathway to really get to the policies we need?
Well, no question. Actually, there's a lot of policies being implemented and being considered right now in the EPA, as my colleague Heather Toney talked about earlier. We're looking at policies that will require electrification of cars, and if strong enough, require electrification of trucks. We're looking at policies to require tremendously stringent, if they're strong enough, rules on methane emissions. We're looking at policies on power plants, on air pollution. So the EPA right now, under Michael Regan, another former colleague, was with EDF for 8 years, now head of the EPA. They are taking aggressive action. We, of course, are pushing them to, clean the air as much as possible. But beyond that, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed has us spending billions of dollars getting lead pipes out of the ground, servicing people's homes. 15 billion, and on the climate side, there's billions of dollars to cap orphan wells that are leaking methane. And right now, the most important policy that has a good chance of passage, because even Joe Manchin has said, he's supportive, is the clean energy tax package, which is $500 billion of positive incentives for things like manufacturing more batteries here in the United States, as our
Michael
was calling for just a few minutes ago, decrying the fact that only 5% are made in America, 70% in China. This package would create jobs in battery plants in the United States and also create incentives for the auto companies to do more infrastructure investments in a quicker conversion to electric vehicles, where cars, we see it happening, but it needs to happen in trucks too, particularly the urban use trucks, which put out so much conventional pollutant to people who live near highways and roads. There's a lot of these uses are already cost effective. Catherine, you were telling me about school buses. Sorry for asking a question.
No, you please.
School buses in Canada, and how maybe unlike California, which is thinking of buying some school buses, in Canada, you were able to figure out a way to leverage each dollar to buy more buses. Can you?
Yeah, so I was also, after the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, I was the Minister of Infrastructure, and we needed to transform what we were doing in infrastructure, and the financing doesn't really work. Why is the government just handing out money all the time? And there's no leveraging. And so the Canada Infrastructure Bank was intended to do that. And so lo and behold, if you took government grant money and the government money went to do the charging, and the Canada Infrastructure Bank helped leverage private sector money on the savings in the back of the buses with the municipalities, you can finance a lot more. And so the reality is, this is the challenge. I spent a lot of time thinking about this because I'm like, how do we get the whole world off coal? It's very expensive. That's actually one thing we just need to do, and it's not that easy. But we've got to figure out more innovative tools. And it's sometimes hard because policymakers, aren't experts in everything. And often, you've got a hammer, you see a nail, you hammer it with the existing tools. And so I think policy innovation is going to be extraordinarily important if we're going to do this. Also discipline, focusing on real problems and not getting distracted, and governments having policy certainty for business. Business needs policy certainty. They may not like the policies, but eventually they will figure it out, ways to work within the policy framework. But that was a good example. And I just realized we didn't have enough money. Like, the prime minister gave me a job and I was like, well, how can we do it? And I think there's a lot of other examples like that where with folks in the room here, we're super smart. You can figure out what we need to do to scale everything, because everything needs to be scaled.
I guess my cynicism about American regulation is partly ill-founded based on what you were saying before, Fred. But, if the challenge is a price for carbon, right? And if we might have a Republican Senate and House, possibly soon, that's the thing you say you really want, which she actually helped happen in a smaller nearby country. A bigger country, or it's bigger by physically, bigger physically, but bigger. Not too many people. But
I won't say better, but
better. You could say that.
You all may want to apply for citizenship.
So you did it. The point is, you did it, but we can't seem to do it. And that's sort of what I guess I'm thinking when you talk about good policy, and you're saying the number one thing you want is a price for carbon. How are we going to get there?
Well, there's a couple of ways. First of all, we've got to think globally. And sitting here in the United States, it looks really hard to do it on the national level. No contest, that's true. It is hard. As Catherine reported, it was hard to do in Canada, but it was done there. However, many countries are moving to price carbon. We have an emissions trading system, not only in Europe, but now the biggest one in the world in China, that the Environmental Defense Fund helped put in place. It's not yet strong enough, and it only covers the power sector. It needs to cover more sectors, but the European Union, when it started its ETS, was also not strong enough, and now you have a price of 80 euros. So it's gotten a lot better, and I'm sure China's will too. In the United States, we are making progress in getting more states, not only California, but now Washington State, and in the East, RGGI states have expanded. The program needs to get tougher. But we are making progress in more and more states are now looking at pricing carbon. And we are not giving up on making this a bipartisan issue, because it's hard, but that doesn't mean, it's a multi-year fight. So if we look at, will it get done this year or next year, unlikely, but we've got to keep talking. We do have champions, even on the Republican side in the Senate, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, Mitt Romney, and others less publicly who understand that it is powerful. When I sat here in the audience listening earlier today to the great interview with Bill Gross, and he talked about one of his 3 companies, I was thinking, wow, it's great, carbon capture, and if he's right, that by 2030 it gets to $100 a ton, that would be great. But then who pays to build the machines? Yeah. Without a price on carbon or a cap and trade system, nobody. So yes, voluntary maybe, but so we really need to price carbon.
I've got an idea.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, I've got a couple ideas. It's because I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So first of all, carbon, having clubs. So we can have clubs. So Canada actually has a club with California because we are in the cap and trade system there. So you can do it. It's messy, right? Like in Canada, I don't actually want to go into it, but we actually had provinces that had their own pricing system, either a direct price or a cap and trade system. And so, it wasn't like perfect. And so we had to work within the confines of that. So I think the more you can bring folks on board, and it may be that you have to do it at the state level to eventually get enough momentum. But I spent a lot of time thinking about border carbon adjustments, because a lot of my American friends, they tell me, well, we need to do border carbon adjustments. I said, well, you need a price. And they're like, well, other regulatory measures. And I said, well, it's very hard to quantify other regulatory measures in a transparent way. So you're going to get stuck at the WTO. It's going to look like it's just a trade barrier. And by the way, Canada's doing other regulatory measures. So now I sound very nerdy. I know that, so I'm going to stop. But the reality is, if it could be a way of dealing with China, India, dumping, other things. So maybe there's a way to do it that way. It will take time, and it will take courage.
And there's a little bit more openness because of the Ukraine war and that kind of thinking, isn't there? I mean, with the sudden awareness of the power of oil and gas to fund, maybe I'm Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Are we going to go down that rabbit hole? We were talking about that. If we
Fred's
get
not
down the
nodding.
Ukraine.
I'll change the subject.
No. Well, look, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a horrendous humanitarian disaster with people dying, and it demands a response. And the fact that it's increased the price of oil is going to cause a lot of pain for a lot of people who can't afford it. And so short-term measures to reduce that pain and reduce the cost, of course, we need to consider. But at the same time, we have a second humanitarian crisis, in that people are dying every year now from climate change, from weather disasters, from floods in Brisbane just a few weeks ago, floods in our west, wildfires, the air in California. I don't need to tell folks about. Many of you live through it. So the trick is, these are twin imperatives.
Yeah.
What are the solutions that answer for both? And the idea of heat pumps to reduce the need for natural gas for heating, the idea of speeding up the electrification of vehicles to reduce overall oil demand. These are solutions, that solve for both of these imperatives.
But I mean, is it going to work? Right? Like, I mean, my biggest concern is it's like a tragedy of complexity, because we were like, okay, we're kind of doing these things on climate, not even in a very coherent way, because we don't have grids. Like, Europe should have one grid, which should be like a better way to do things. But now you've layered this on. So there's a choice. World can choose. It's very hard. Like, we already know how far we are from where we need to be on climate. And so if we lock in some long-term infrastructure, it's going to be impossible. Like, and not to be very sad about it, but it's just true. So I think we need to really need to think about, what do you deal with a short-term problem by also making sure that you're focused on the long-term. And by the way, that's an energy security issue. And we sometimes miss that piece. But I mean, what Fred said, it's really important. It made me think about it with the awesome kick-ass, I don't know if the women are here, the panel on climate justice, so way to go. Is another policy innovation we have, and it's going to sound really nerdy, but I'm slightly a nerd because I just care about outcomes, and you sometimes have to do things that require, like, looking outside the box. We brought in, and it's a gender-based analysis to policy. When you actually do that, you find out, and GBA plus, so it's broader than that, but you actually are able to have a much more sophisticated understanding of what happens to your policies. We know that women are disproportionately impacted by climate change, but there's also historically disadvantaged groups, and in Canada, Indigenous peoples, massive issue. And so if you're going to be thoughtful at policy, you need to actually say, what outcome are you trying to get? Are you designing a policy that's actually going to get that outcome? Do you understand that, if you're poor, you're less likely to be able to handle flooding? You're more likely to live in a place where it floods, and you're less likely to be able to afford to deal with it. And that's just one example. And so I actually think policy does matter. Like, outcomes matter, and diligence matters, but you have to, you have to be a little more sophisticated and thoughtful about it. And you also do have to work with industry. And that was always my problem. My problem is I get slammed on all sides. Like, everyone, probably EDF gets that too, right? Like, everyone's kind of mad at you. And you just have to kind of keep on just going through and trying to figure out how are all these pieces going to come together, because policy really does matter. But you're not always going to get it. And you're not always going to get the government you want to do the policy.
Well, I got more questions, but is anybody here? Oh, VJ has a question. All right. Well, that would be a good question.
Oh, no.
You better be good now. But
Where's VJ? Is he going to ask
VJ
Ukraine?
is the
we already dealt with Ukraine.
environment
VJ.
guy from The Economist, so he probably has a good question.
Thanks, David. Vijay from The Economist. Thanks. Well, first, I want to start by saying how encouraging it is and heartening to see the robust support for carbon pricing. And Catherine, congratulations on that revenue neutral approach that you've been able to implement with all the scars on your back. I know how hard it is. Fred will remember 20 years ago, I advocated on the pages of The Economist a revenue neutral carbon tax, and I got a lot of heat for it, and we've had a lot of conversations over the years. So I'm pleased to see this idea advance on the stage. I wanted to actually talk, just very briefly ask for reaction from the stage on the efforts to send US LNG to Europe. to help Europe out of its bind at the moment. Fred, what is your perspective on the environmental implications? Is it a completely terrible idea? Are there ways to do this that would be consistent with environmental objectives or to avoid lock-in with infrastructure, something that's a concern sometimes with natural gas? Can you give us your thought on this?
Sure. Europe has dependence on Russian natural gas and the pipelines that come from Russia. And it's a serious issue when Russia is behaving in a way that is barbaric. So the world is now scrambling to reroute LNG tankers from a lot of different places. In the short run, you cannot build LNG plants fast enough to do anything about the problem. The capacity in the United States is pretty much maxed out. I don't think Canada has yet an LNG export terminal. There are a dozen in the permitting stage. Some are near approval or approved, but I think it would be a huge mistake beyond, perhaps one or two that are being constructed to lock in, as Catherine said, a lot of LNG capacity. First of all, Europe has pledged to be off natural gas by 2027.
Really?
Yeah, so there is no way you can finance another LNG export terminal. These things require 10-year contracts, 15, 20-year contracts. If the Europeans are going to finance that, they're going to be in a lot of trouble with their own constituencies, having just promised within a few weeks ago to get off it. So I think the real answers have to be reducing. In the short term, you can't build these things fast enough to address the instant crisis. And over the medium term, let's use the Defense Production Act to create, export more heat pumps to Europe and minimize their need for natural gas. So that's my response.
Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time, although I'm very tired, so I'm kind of glad we're over. But I just wanted to put one sort of mildly optimistic note. Remember how in the 2016 presidential campaign, in all the debates between Hillary and Trump, climate never came up once? That's how much we've changed. That could never happen now. So policymakers know they have to care about this. It's incredible that only 5.5 years ago, that was not true. So I guess I'm mildly encouraged by that, but I'm always encouraged by hearing people like you, particularly Fred, since I've known you so long, just getting to know you, but you're good too. And
Thanks, amazing.
thank you
We'll
so
take it.
much for coming and having a great conversation, and thank you.